kind of anatomy of forks and shocks, because I think a lot of people aren't super familiar with what is going on inside. I don't have a blown apart shock, but I do have a shock handy. I've got a fork, so I can kind of go over some of the things going on with the forks, some of the adjustments that you can make. I also have a rear shock, so we can talk about some of the knobs and buttons um, and what they do. So we'll start with the fork. So kind of basic anatomy of the fork. We've got your lowers, which is this section here. So the lowers slide up and down on the uppers. So the uppers encase like the steer tube, which inserts into your bike, the crown, and then each stanchion here. And the lowers have seals right there and there. And whenever someone says that you need like 50-hour service or lower seal service, this is what they're talking about. These are the seals that they're going to replace. And there's oil that goes in the bottom of your fork, and that's it. So 50-hour service is lower seal replacement and oil replacement, and that's it. So what that does is that keeps all of the dirt and the grime from working its way into the most important parts of your suspension, which is the top, right? So we've got the damper side here, typically on the drive side of your bike, and then an air side. And the lowers, right, you want to have as little friction as possible. And then this keeps all of the dirt from working its way into the damper cartridge or the air side of your fork, keeping all of the air pressure. So what I do is I do complete overhauls of forks. So I'll pull the lowers off of your fork, and then I'll pull all the guts out. So the air side comes out and the damper side comes out, and all of these things have little O-rings and oils that need to be replaced. So whenever you're looking at the function of a fork, you have two sides, right? Air and damper. So the air side just gives you a baseline. So this is set up based on mostly your weight with all of your riding gear. And there's usually a helpful chart on the back of your forks that say, hey, if you weigh this much, you should run this PSI. And that's just a starting point for most people. So that can also change depending on if you're going to go on a longer ride, you're going to be carrying more water. If you have your bike loaded up with gear, that also needs to be taken into account. So I like to have a shock pump at home, and most of the bike shops in town will sell some sort of shock pump. This is kind of a nicer digital one, so it gives you a more accurate reading, but the analog ones do just fine too. And then you can kind of play with your baseline air pressure. And so whenever you set a baseline air pressure, most forks will recommend a percentage of sag. So you typically will have an O-ring. I don't know if you can see that. You'll have an O-ring on the stanchion of your fork, and you'll want to push it all the way down. You'll want to make sure that your damper is all the way open so that it moves freely. So you don't want it locked out when you're trying to set your sag, because then your fork's not going to do anything. It's just going to stay put, right? So you want that all the way open. You want to shove that O-ring all the way to the bottom. And then you want to kind of get on your bike, bounce it a little bit, move that O-ring to the bottom again. And then you'll want to be in kind of a neutral standing riding position. So not so far over the front of your bike and not like lean too far back over the rear tire. And then you'll want to, as carefully as you can, step off of the bike and measure your sag. So what that'll do, right? Your body weight and all your gear will shove this O-ring up a particular amount, right? Based on how much air pressure that you have in it. And most bikes, their geometries are designed around a percentage, a sag percentage. And so you want to make sure that you're kind of in a recommended range for the bike. So sometimes longer travel bikes will have a 30% sag recommendation, and this is over the travel. So you would want 30% of 170 or 160, or if you have 140 millimeters of travel, you're looking for 30% of that or 25% of that. And sometimes companies will have helpful tools with their forks, like something like this. This is a Fox 32. It just like clips around the stanchion, and that O-ring will slide down and slide in like this range, and you'll be able to tell pretty easy what sag percentage. The other way to do it is to, right, so just like this. So that O-ring will be able to slide down, and you'll be able to tell what percentage of sag you are, what sag you have based on the air pressure that you have in your fork. And all of this is applicable to the rear shock as well. It's kind of the same, but looks different. So you'll have your baseline air pressure, an O-ring, and then you measure the sag based on the travel and your weight. So this is just a really easy way to start getting in the right realm of setting up your suspension. This is like the first thing that you'll want to do is open up your damper and set your sag. So getting a shock pump is super helpful for air sprung suspension so that you can adjust it to suit your weight. So you can custom tune your bike to ride exactly the way that you want. I also know people that ride outside of their weight ranges. So you might not be able to like sit on your bike and compress it to that 30%, but you may ride hard enough, right, that you would want to run a higher air pressure. So this is just kind of a baseline to get you started, but there's a lot of adjustments that can be done to make it feel really good too. I don't know if anyone has questions. You're more than welcome to ding in and ask at any time. So I'll move on to maybe some of the adjustments that the damper can do. Some dampers, and the damper side, if you're confused about maybe what a damper is it's kind of the brains of your suspension. So the air side just kind of sets this baseline custom weight for you. So you put the right PSI in there. That's all it does really. The damper side, this is where you can control how it reacts. So like you've set your sag, you're at like 20 to 30%, which is pretty recommended range for most forks. And then the damper controls how quickly the fork compresses, and it also controls how quickly it bounces back or rebounds. So this is where your ride style, where you're riding, can change your fork settings. If you ride really fast and you like to ride over a lot of roots and rocks, then the rebound setting might be something that you need to pay attention to. And the rebound is on the bottom of your fork, and it's usually red. So red for rebound is how I like to remember the rebound adjustment. And you can make this faster or slower. So whenever you compress your suspension, it will either come back like really slowly or it'll come back really fast. So if you sometimes feel like maybe your hands hurt or your shoulders are giving you, some issues after a ride. Sometimes it's your suspension that needs a little tweaking to make the ride feel really good. So you can change by turning this adjustment knob. Either way, there's usually arrows, or like Fox has plus and minus signs, and RockShox will have a turtle and a rabbit or a hare to indicate it's a faster rebound or a slower rebound. In this case, the plus is more rebound damping, so it'll be slower, and then the minus is less rebound damping, which is faster, which is sometimes confusing, but it's easy to check. And these are adjustments that can be made on the fly, and they're on the outside of your bike. They're meant to be played with. And so you shouldn't be, nervous about changing all of the adjustments on your bike. There are definitely some instances where it would feel bad if you had it super slow, or if you had it super fast, if that's not what your bike needed for you. Um, but to try and dial in your ride, it's nice to get a feel for what the slowest setting and maybe what the fastest setting feels like. So a lot of people will run it on the faster end, the rebound on the faster end, because what we don't want is for you to hit a bunch of features or a bunch of rocks and roots consecutively, and for your suspension to pack down. And what that means is that you'll hit something and your suspension will compress, and it will be too slow to come back. And instead, you'll hit something else and it'll compress again, and it'll compress again and again, right? It's like super fast, but your suspension isn't able to recover from it. So that's what packing down is, and that happens when your rebound is too slow. So if you're, kind of a faster rider and you like to hit stuff quickly and roots and rocks, and you like a bunch of features, then maybe a faster rebound might work better for you and feel better. On the opposite end, if it's too fast, then it'll feel like your front end is kind of like punching you in the face, right? And you don't want to feel beat up at the end of that, because it can be really fast. Um, so you don't want it too fast and you don't want it too slow, but people have maxed them out. So I know some riders will run it as fast as they can because that's what they need. And then there are some adjustments that you can make internally to the damper itself to change how fast. So that's where like diving in and doing some custom tuning is kind of a cool thing. If you feel like your fork is not doing enough for you, sometimes there are options that you can change the internals. The compression side, you can, this one only has one dial. Sometimes they have two. So this one is just affecting the low speed. They will classify damper compressions as low speed and high speed compression. Low speed compression is that initial bump. So that initial stroke, the top end. So your lockout is what most companies with one dial will call it. And that is technically low speed compression, is when you're going around berms uphill, or if you're hitting something at a super low speed. So um, it seems a little self-explanatory, but sometimes it can be a little confusing because then they have high speed compression. And really, it's just the speed at which your fork travel is moving. So high speed is whenever your fork is moving at a greater speed through more of your travel. So whenever you hit like big drops, um, and you're moving through your suspension quickly, that is high speed compression. And sometimes the forks will have both. This one doesn't. It only has the one. So this is the Fox grip damper. So it's just one dial, and it affects the overall firmness of the um, the full length of the travel. So it's less about a lockout and more about a high speed compression. Sometimes they'll also have high and low speed compression on the rebound, but most forks will have just the single rebound, um, which will be like the high speed rebound. Do we have any questions about like fork anatomy, or if someone has any questions about how they feel about their own fork, personal questions at all? Oh, so the question is, how can you tell whether there's grime and junk in the fork, right? And then how do you know when to clean it? So a lot of the times it'll stop feeling smooth. The seals are sometimes a good indicator, so you can take a look to see what your seals look like. Fox and RockShox both recommend every 50 hours of riding. So it can be kind of hard to calculate, but if you use Strava, sometimes you can calculate pretty easily. Or if you ride, 3 times a week for a couple hours, then you can kind of add up. Usually people will do 50-hour service once every 6 months, and then every year a full rebuild. And that's kind of what the recommended service intervals for front and rear suspension are. And that'll just get all of the gunk and grime out of all of the things and make them super slippery and plush again. So great question. And the sometimes, right, so whenever you pull the fork apart, there's oil in the bottom of here, and it's super important to make sure that you're replacing the seals and you're putting new oil in here, because that is going to keep everything on the inside working nicely. And eventually, like if you are not getting the rest of your suspension taken care of, it'll slowly deteriorate. Most of the suspension is in a cartridge. So like if I pulled this top cap off, I could unthread the damper and it would be like a completely sealed unit. And there's a bunch of oil inside of that, and that oil will go bad. And so sometimes if you feel like you can't lock your fork out, or if it's not functioning, so like if you turn the rebound and you're like, that's not doing anything, right? That's when you need to get a full rebuild and get new seals and new oils in the damper. And the air side will do the same thing. There's just a bunch of O-rings and grease that make the system work. And eventually that stuff goes bad. They're kind of like windshield wipers on cars. So the question is, why do the two sides have different components inside? And that just makes it easier. So it's kind of like a shock, right? So it would be if you had the air and the damper on one side, you'd essentially just have this unit. So to save weight and frustration for anyone taking it apart, they've decided, and it doesn't make any difference like which side the air is on and which side the damper is on, but to have the two systems separated makes the whole system a lot easier, cleaner, lighter. Because you would essentially have a shock that on both sides if you had both the damper and the air side combined. So it would be like having like two separate shocks, one here and one here. That would be like a really heavy system I'm sure there are some big beefy suspension systems like that, like your car, right? So if you think like each suspension strut is essentially that, right? So instead, they've got one unit connected by lowers to do the same thing in kind of a lighter package. So with the rear shock, like something like this, you've got the damper system, which has oil inside of it. This has oil inside of it, and it's running through the center of this shock. On the outside, this can, they call this air can. Air is surrounding the damper part of the shock. So whenever they say to get 50-hour air can service, they're literally just taking the air can off and replacing the seals in the can, and then a couple of seals on the body and in the upper eyelet. And that is air can service. It's like if you were to only do the air side of this fork, and that's it. It would be like combining, like this seal is kind of like this seal. So the air can service does this seal and like the whole air side. And that's what the air can service is for rear shock. Whenever you get down into it, it's just full of oil. And then there's an air spring that creates the rebound. So in here, you have oil creating a rebound and air creating a rebound. For a rear shock, you also have air and oil creating a rebound, but it's kind of in a different package. So if you were to pull the air can off, you could like push down on the shock and it would come back. If you had the lowers off of this fork, you could push down on the rebound or on the damper side, but it wouldn't come back in the same way as this guy because there's an air spring essentially. So the rear shocks can get a little bit more complicated because they are kind of this one package that does a lot of things, and there's a lot of components inside of here. In the bottom, there is a port to put a very high pressure of air or nitrogen. Fox recommends nitrogen, and so you need a nitrogen fill machine to put a load of pressure behind a piston, and that creates the rebound effect in this shock. So what happens is whenever you push and like actuate this, it's pushing down on an air spring, and then whenever you release it, the air spring goes back to where it was, which creates the rebound. And the oil inside, you can change how quickly or how slowly it passes through shim stack. And so whenever you're adjusting your rebound, you can make it slower or faster, right? So if you make it slower, then you're making it harder for oil to pass through little ports inside of it. And so whenever I do full rebuilds, we're just making sure all the ports are clean, the oil is good, all the seals are replaced, and that there's no oil in the system, because that will make a really squeaky or like a squelching noise in your suspension. And so sometimes, you know, if it's not holding air, then that's usually just air can surface. If it's doing anything other than not holding air and being weird, then that's like a full rebuild service, where you have to tear the whole thing apart. Any more questions about stuff like that? Super caliber. Hang on, let me read all of these things. So for the lockout, right? The lockout is good. It's fine to ride it locked out. That is the whole reason why they even have a lockout. It's totally fine to do that. It is better for your fork if it's open the majority of the time. There are foam rings and good oil in your system. And if your fork isn't cycling that oil, then it's not cleaning or keeping your stanchions lubricated. There are like bushings inside of the fork lowers, and all of that stuff needs to stay like really clean and lubricated. And so sometimes if you were to ride a fork locked out all of the time, you would just destroy it pretty quickly, just because it cannot get its lubrication. And yes, you're constantly putting this massive amount of pressure on the shim stacks that are trying to prevent it from moving. So it's not a good idea to like always ride it locked out. But if you were to say ride up hillside and accidentally leave it in its locked out position, that's not the end of the world. It should be fine, but it's not recommended. It would feel really terrible. So I'd try to open it up if you could. Morgan, you've got the Trek Super Caliber. So I have seen the Super Caliber. This is kind of a really different bike. I haven't gotten a chance to service one. It seems as though that it's kind of an interesting rear suspension design for sure. It's totally serviceable. Whether I could do it here, I'm not sure. Trek is kind of protective of their proprietary information. So I can sometimes work with the Trek store, and I've been working with a lot of the shops directly and getting information about all of the different types of proprietary suspension. Trek has been probably one of the more difficult ones, that and Scott proprietary suspension. But yeah, the goal would be to be able to service as much suspension that is necessary for Alaska. So if this is something that you have, I know a couple people that have the Super Caliber in Anchorage, and eventually it will have to get serviced. So it would be nice to figure out what it would need. But yes, it's kind of the same concept. It'll need like 50-hour seal service as well as complete rebuild every year. But it is a different suspension design that I'm pretty excited to dig into. It almost has like two seals on the end, like the whole unit, the whole rear end slides up and down a stanchion, and then the guts of that are kind of inside. It's like having an open-ended air can, which is kind of funny. Any other questions? No. Yeah. And you can reach out to I think I know you, Morgan. We've hung out before. I remember you from a lot of the Anchorage events, and I'm super stoked that you have a Super Caliber. So yes, you'll need to plan ahead, and I will need to plan ahead. So I can start doing some research on figuring out how to service that particular shock for sure. So we can keep in touch if that sounds good. And I'll talk to the guys at Trek because I've been working with them to try and get as much information on their proprietary things as possible, and doing a lot of their suspension as well. Yeah, that's right. Cool. Not a problem. Eat your dinner. So does everybody feel pretty comfortable with maybe setting up their suspension? Has anyone set up their suspension before? Or do you just set it and forget it? Well, you don't have to set it up all of the time. Sometimes it takes a while to get it to feel good. And that's fine. Like setting it up at the beginning of the season and just like riding it all season, as long as it's feeling good, then that's totally fine. And you shouldn't really have to adjust your air pressure. Like it really, if you're like getting your suspension like taken care of like once a year or once every 100 hours of riding, then there shouldn't be any worry of it like leaking, or it should hold its baseline air pressure. So you're not that comfortable setting up any air pressure at all. And a lot of the shops will help you kind of set that baseline. And a lot of the shops will have the tool. So I can kind of show you what that looks like. So whenever you set your air pressure, there's an air cap that you take off. There's the air side. Looks like a Schrader valve. And then you need a special pump. So you can't just use any pump with it. You have to have a shock pump. This will allow for a smaller volume of air to enter the air chamber, because the air chamber is really tiny. So if you used a regular pump, you would be blasting a huge volume of air into a very small space and potentially damaging little tiny seals. So this guy, we got 81 PSI, right? So for whoever's riding this bike, right, 81 PSI, they're probably in the, and it'll tell you on the back of your fork, but also you can like look up PSI ranges for your body weight, rider weight. So 85's in like, the 190 pound range. So the front fork, generally you would want to do half of your body weight to like start if you're unsure. And then you would want to set your sag. So the most important part is to set your sag. So the fork may say, hey, like you weigh 100 pounds, like you should set it to 50 pounds. But if you're 100 pounds, but your neutral riding position is a little forward leaning, or whenever you're riding, you're not moving through a lot of your travel, then dropping the air pressure a little bit and then trying that sag setting, trying to do a couple of runs to see like where your O-ring sits. So that's another thing that you can use your O-ring for, is that sometimes I'll just shove it to the bottom before I do a run. And then at the end of my run, I want to make sure that it is closer to the 90 percentile of its travel. So I want to make use of every bit of travel that I can, because I have the travel. Like I wouldn't want to, buy a 150 millimeter travel fork and not use the majority of it. So then we would want to make sure that your O-ring is kind of sitting like pretty close to the crown of your fork. So the shock pumps have like a little button that you can use to like adjust fine. So you can kind of fine tune your PSI. And whenever you remove the shock pump, you'll hear a little bit of air escape, and it's only air from the tube. So it's not actually losing PSI from the fork. So whenever you pump this back up, you can pump it back to 81 PSI, and remove it, it'll make a little sound, but it's only the air coming from the hose of your pump and not from the actual fork. So it still should be set at 81. What confuses a lot of people is when you put your shock pump back onto the fork, it'll read a lower PSI because the air will travel from the fork through the tube, right? So that creates a little bit larger volume space, and it'll read a little bit lower PSI. And so depending on your fork, sometimes you can add air, remove it, add it again to see how much it drops, and then you can kind of calculate how much air pressure was in the fork. Usually it's just a few PSI that it drops whenever you connect a pump. For the adjustments on your rear shock, they're essentially the same type of adjustments that are on your front. So you'll have kind of a lockout. So that's what this guy is here. And this is like a firm to open, but it also has a small 3mm Allen key that you can adjust the high-speed compression. So some shocks have more or less adjustments than others. And if you're like really into having all of the adjustments and playing with all of the knobs, then there are some shocks that are nicer than others. It doesn't necessarily mean it's the right suspension type for you. Some people do better with just kind of a one knob and set it and forget it, and it's great. But there can be, you know, up to 6 or 7 things that you can adjust in a fork, and that can be overwhelming for a lot of people. But yep, red is rebound, so that's an easy thing to spot, is the rebound adjustment, because typically they're all going to be red. Blue is kind of like a universal color for compression, so high speed and low speed compression. Did that answer your question, Jeanette? Sweet. But the same thing goes with your baseline air pressure in your rear shock as well. So there'll be a percentage. It can be a little harder to determine the percentage because the amount of travel on the shock itself is not written on the shock usually. Some of the rock shocks will say, but some of the shocks won't. So your bike will say, oh, it's a 150, 140 travel. So they'll be like, the front suspension is 150, the rear travel is 140, but that is not talking about the travel of the shock itself. It's talking about the movement of the suspension geometry of your bike. So if someone's like, oh, I've got 120, 120, it's like actually 120 front suspension, but the rear suspension might be 65 or 50 or 52 and a half for the actual shock that's on your bike. But because of the pivots of the bike can create a larger range of motion for the actual suspension geometry, and that's where they get that number. But the actual stroke length of the rear shock is how you need to determine the sag. So for something like this is probably close to like 65 millimeters of travel, and you would need to do a percentage of that. So 20 to 25 or 30% sag of 65 is kind of what you're looking at for that. You can take a physical measurement with like a set of calipers for something like this, or for most of the Fox products, they will have a tune ID. So that's what that guy is. This will tell you the size of your shock. So it'll give you 2 numbers, and then the second number will be the stroke length. So one number will be the eye-to-eye measurement, which is like how long the shock is in full, and then the second number is going to be your stroke length, and this is how you figure out the sag setting for your rear shock. RockShox has made this a lot easier by having the sag percentages printed on their stanchion. So it's a little more difficult with Fox products, but RockShox patented that. So Fox and other products, they can't copy it. So you're just gonna have to measure if you've got Fox. If you've got RockShox, they make it a lot easier because it's just printed right on the stanchion of both the forks and the rear shocks. So it's easy to like take a peek and be like, yep, that's 30%, or yep, I've got 20% and looking good. So that's kind of an easy thing to do. Any other questions? Yeah, I can definitely talk about tuning. Does the air leak from the fork during each ride? No, it should not leak from the fork during each ride. You shouldn't have to recalibrate the PSI. As long as you're getting your service done like frequently, right? So if you haven't had like overhaul service on your suspension at all, then it could be leaking for sure. Typically, if you get a full overhaul, then you shouldn't have that problem at all. And it's just seals that need to be replaced with new fluids and grease. So you shouldn't have to check it. So tuning means a little, it has a different meaning for some people. So you can do a lot of like, oh, I see. Okay, so general, okay. So each shock, right? So this says it has a custom tune ID. So what that means is that inside of this shock, there could be a number of different shim stack configurations to make this feel different. So there are probably 20 different shim stacks to choose from for this particular shock, and it can make the rebound faster or slower. It could make it more digressive or linear. It could make the compression firmer or softer. And there are a lot of different ways to make this shock work for someone specifically. That being said, a lot of brands will choose exactly what custom tuning that they want for a particular bike. And so whenever some manufacturers say that it's been custom tuned for like women specific, I may not know what that means right out of the gate, but if you give me the like the tune ID, we can look it up to see what they mean. Like, does that mean that for that particular bike that they've made the compression softer? Potentially. That they've made the rebound slower, maybe. But I do know that it's sometimes not recommended to change it. I know that some companies like Transition have custom tunes that are not available to change necessarily. Like, you can change them, but Transition would be like, no, this is absolutely the best tune for the geometry of this bike and the way that it is intended to ride. So sometimes the best thing to do is to maybe leave it unless you know exactly what you want out of it or exactly the changes that you want. And that can be really difficult to know, because you have to know what you have in your suspension and the options and what those options will do for you. So like if you get like a firm rebound, that'll actually make your rebound slower. So there are definitely a lot of options for tuning your suspension. And most of the time, the manufacturer will just recommend that you listen to the engineers that decided that that particular tune code is ideal for the type of riding that they expect you to do for your bike. And whenever people are going outside of the recommended riding for particular bikes, sometimes that means that their bike's not working well for them for that reason, and maybe not because of the reason that they need a different tune. But there are all sorts of riders and types, and I've definitely been doing a couple, different tuning, and it's a lot of fun, and it's a lot of fun to talk about. So if anyone has any questions about like changing the way that they want their bike to ride, sometimes there are options and sometimes there aren't. For this particular one, the DPX2 from Fox, they've got a ton of shim stack options to make your bike feel different and better, hopefully not worse. I hope that answered that question. Anything else? Did I stump you guys? Or confuse you? No questions? Do a lot of you have droppers as well? Most of the new full suspensions will come with dropper posts, and some of those are rebuildable and some of them aren't. The Fox Transfer and the RockShox Reverb are kind of the more popular ones. Electronic dropper post, sick. Oh yeah, I'll touch a little bit more on maintenance for sure. So the daily maintenance, there's not a whole lot to do. But what I would say is to try and keep the stanchions of your suspension as clean as you can. So after you get done riding, or before if they're still dirty from your last ride, to try and clean off all of the stuck on dirt and mud from your stanchion. So this is the stanchion of your rear shock, and these are the stanchions of your front fork. So you don't want to be pushing mud into the lowers of your forks or into the air can of your rear shock. So to wipe all of this stuff clean after every ride, and sometimes I just do it while I'm riding because I just want to make sure everything's looking nice, so I don't have to clean it as often. But keeping that clean is like the best thing that you could do. If you get one of those like awesome mud guards that go, those little plastic mud guards, that is like the number one thing, the best thing that you could potentially do for your fork. You can also kind of get it for the rear shock, but not really. They kind of have some little mud guards that'll fit in the back of your bike, but this will keep all of the mud and dirt from like collecting into this area and getting shoved like into the seals. So if you don't have one, get one of those little mud guards. Most of the shops have them, and they will absolutely do wonders for protecting your stanchions. Because if your stanchions wear out, then you're just gonna get mud and dirt inside of your lowers, and it'll just more quickly work its way up into the rest of your fork. So make sure your stanchions are clean and scratch free as much as possible. Electronic dropper posts are pretty sweet. But yeah, RockShox reverbs, Reverb Axis is the electronic. Shimano has an electronic one, but I haven't seen that one yet. But Fox transfers, those are the droppers that are able to be completely torn apart and rebuilt. A lot of the other droppers around just have a cartridge, and it's kind of like you pull the cartridge out after it stops working and you put a new one in. So that's kind of the nicer thing about having a RockShox dropper or a Fox dropper, is that all the little parts inside can be replaced pretty easily and rebuilt, and it feels like brand new. So that's really cool. You have a Scott Spark. So depending on the year, you could be able to install, you could probably install a dropper. You need to know a few things before you order one, because there are a bunch of different sizes. So you have like seat post diameter. So you have to know your seat post diameter. You have to know your actual seat post height. So that'll determine like the travel, so like the amount that it'll drop. And then you have to make sure that you have enough space inside of your frame for a seat post to install. They come in externally routed, so on the outside of your frame, and internally routed. So if you have a frame that doesn't have the ports for an internally routed system, you have to do an externally routed dropper post. So there should be some options out there for you. Generally, they'll range like low end of dropper posts are like $150 or $200, and then the upper end for like a Fox or a RockShox regular post is in the $400, $450 dollar range, and then electronic dropper posts are in the $800 range. And those are new, so I expect that those prices will come down on the electronic wireless droppers, but those look pretty sweet, because then you can just like pop a post into whatever bike you're riding, as long as the seat post size is the same. And it's, you know, you don't have to like connect anything, it's already connected. You just like pop it in, put your dropper lever on, and you're good to go. You don't have to wire, route anything. So that's pretty cool. So I like that. The how's the Axis? You have the Axis Reverb, Morgan? Is that a good one? You liking it? It looks pretty sweet. I want one. Anything else? Yeah, the man, SRAM, I feel like they've really nailed it with the wireless shifting and the wireless dropper post. That is absolutely amazing. The batteries are really small, so it seems like pretty easy to just carry spares if you need it. See? Yep. You can just steal a battery. That's perfect. Yeah, I feel like they're always kind of one step ahead of Shimano. Shimano tries. I like Shimano a lot though. Well, when you're in town next, maybe I'll hit you up and we can ride bikes, so I can try your bike. Check your sag. Man, that's awesome. I'm short. This is perfect. Let me know when you're ready to sell. Any other questions? We have a few more minutes. So also, if you think of something after, you can just shoot us an email. Happy to answer any questions afterwards too. It can be kind of confusing, you know, suspension's not all cut and dry, and there are a lot of things that you can do to make it feel different. So sometimes you'll only know what sucks. You know, you'll be like, well, that didn't feel good. And then trying to translate that into what adjustments you should make can be difficult. So feel free to reach out if you have any questions about what's going on. I also have a couple of tools that I rent out. I do private suspension classes as well. So if you want kind of a private lesson. We'll do set up kind of your baseline as far as air pressure, rebound settings, compression settings, all of that stuff. And then I've got a tool called the ShockWiz. So this is kind of a cool little computer that gets installed into the air port of a rear shock or a front shock. And you download this app, and then it helps you put words to how your bike is feeling. So it is a really great tool for someone who's just not very intuitive yet about what their bike is doing. This tool will give you bad riding characteristics. So like if your rear suspension is packing down, if you're feeling like it, or if it's pogoing. So like if your rebound's too fast, sometimes your suspension will just like bounce back, right? So like say you are like coming up on the lip of a jump, you compress your front fork, you compress your rear suspension, you go off the lip, right? And then your rear suspension is way faster than your front suspension. You'll get this like tipping as you're like coming off the lip. You'll come off the lip, and then your rear suspension will like pop your back end up, right? And so this tool will help like diagnose some of those characteristics and help you put like words to what your suspension is doing and what that feels like. So the next time it happens, you're like, crap, okay, I get it. Like, I understand what this is now because this tool is helping me figure out what that characteristic is. And so that can be the biggest hurdle, right? So there is also this balance that has to happen between your front fork and your rear shock. So you need to make sure that they're kind of talking to each other in a way, that one is not dramatically different than the other, that the front suspension feels as equal to the rear suspension as possible. The settings may be different, but the feeling we want to be the same. So I do private stuff like that too, if you're interested. Yep. Alexa. That is probably why that happens. A lot of times it's a really fast rebound. Yeah, some pop. Any other questions? We're kind of coming to the end here. Nothing.
All right, well, I'll jump back in here. This is Alexa again. My mind is just blown. See if I can get that thing adjusted.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Cool. Well, thank you everybody for sticking with us. This has been a really awesome conversation. I feel like I am so much more knowledgeable now about how it's all works.
Hey Alexa, we're having a hard time hearing you a little bit.
Geez. Thank you, Katie. You're super awesome.
Thank you. Thank you guys. Thanks for having me and for spending a beautiful evening with me.
All right, you guys. I'm pretty sure that I was able to successfully record this. So I'm going to try that recording out and share it with you guys, and then probably with our devices. We can kind of distribute that for folks who weren't able to join us. If you do have any questions, you can always reach out to me or Katie. You can always just reply to that wrap-up email that you'll see, and that goes straight to us, and we can always help you out with questions later on. I know, like me, like you kind of can't even think about what to ask right now. You've got to let it, marinate for a little while, and it'll come to you later. So yeah, just let us know what you think, and then keep an eye out. We are going to have a couple more clinics before the season is out, so we'll be in your inbox in a little bit with more information.
Awesome.
All right. Thanks, ladies. We're going to wrap up here. Thanks again to Katie for putting this all together. We'll have a
Thank
little
you.
more information on how to find the Dirt House if you are looking to schedule your next suspension service. And that'll go out with our wrap up email too.
Perfect. Sounds good. Thanks, guys. Have a good evening.
Night, everybody.